The air inside the forward operating base briefing tent was heavy with dust and sweat, the kind that clung to the back of the throat and made every breath feel like it carried sand. Captain Elena Ramirez sat near the back, uniform pressed, posture perfect, eyes fixed on the projection screen where terrain maps flickered under the hum of the generator. She didn't fidget, didn't shift in her chair, but her stillness made her stand out among the younger soldiers who whispered, joked, and tapped restless fingers on rifle straps. Her ribbons and insignia marked her as a veteran of campaigns most of them had only read about, but lately that distinction felt more like a weight than an honor. She wasn't supposed to be in logistics. That had never been her path. But after Kandahar rumors started, after one careless comment turned into a wildfire of whispers, command had quietly moved her out of the line. Officially, it was reassignment based on operational needs. Unofficially, it was because too many people had begun saying the same poisonous line, "Women can't handle combat pressure." The lieutenant leading the briefing droned on about convoy routes and supply allocations, his voice sharp but empty, the tone of someone who hadn't yet learned what chaos sounded like, up close. Elena barely heard him. She was tracking the murmurs 3 rows ahead, the tilted heads and sly glances. "She's basically the mascot," one private muttered. He thought he was quiet, but the canvas walls carried sound in strange ways. "She only made it back because she stayed behind the guys with rifles," another snickered. The laughter was soft, mean, a blade drawn under the table. Elena's jaw didn't move. Her gaze never wavered from the map. Years of discipline held her body still, but the words sank deep. Every scar along her arms and ribs seemed to burn at once. Her chest tightened with the memory of nights when she'd clawed through dirt to drag men heavier than her across fields lit by tracer fire, the weight of their blood soaking through her gear. And here, in this tent, with its stale air and flickering lights, all of it was being reduced to a joke. She swallowed once, the movement small, invisible to anyone watching. Silence had become her armor. She had learned that speaking only fueled the whispers. Still, she felt the sting as keenly as she had felt shrapnel, sharp and unrelenting. The lieutenant's voice faded into the background, drowned out by the sound of memory. She was back there again, on a night that had no date in the records, no official acknowledgement. The moon was a sliver, the kind of pale light that made shadows look alive. Gunfire cracked in the distance, closer every second. Elena's chest heaved as she dragged Corporal Simmons by the straps of his vest, his leg mangled, his blood painting a dark trail in the dirt. Beside her, Sergeant Holloway lay unconscious, twice her size, yet she had refused to leave him. She had hooked her arms beneath his shoulders, teeth clenched as rounds snapped past, chewing up earth at her feet. Her legs screamed, her lungs burned, but she moved. Inch by inch, breath by breath, until the extraction bird roared in overhead like salvation itself. She had hauled them both into the safety of its belly, collapsing only when the door slammed shut. The flash of rotor wash faded. The dust of Kandahar's briefing tent returned. Elena's hand had tightened imperceptibly into a fist on the table, knuckles pale against her skin. She released it slowly, letting the air back into her lungs. Around her, the whispers had died down, the soldiers turning their attention back to the lieutenant's dull monotone. None of them would ever know the weight of that night. None of them would ever understand the price she had paid to sit in this chair. Her face remained unreadable, her eyes steady, but inside her chest the barbs of their laughter lingered, sharper than any bullet. The morning had been quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of stillness that made even the most seasoned soldier uneasy. Dust rose in thin curtains behind the convoy as the trucks rolled out along the pitted road, engines growling low against the endless sprawl of Kandahar's arid plains. Captain Elena Ramirez sat in the back of the lead vehicle, her rifle propped casually across her knees. Officially, she was only along to observe logistics, another way of saying she had been benched. Her lieutenant, young and sharp in all the wrong ways, sat up front giving instructions into the radio like a man who believed he'd already earned his stripes. Elena didn't argue. She rarely did anymore. The battle wasn't against insurgents, these days it was against perception. Against whispers that her combat days had been an illusion, that she'd been shielded by luck, by others, by circumstance. She let them think what they wanted, until the world broke open. The first explosion ripped through the quiet, with a roar that cracked bone and sky alike. The lead Humvee jolted sideways, its tires shredded, fire belching from beneath the hood. Shrapnel punched holes through the side panel, embedding hot steel in Elena's vest. She hit the floor hard as the lieutenant was thrown against the windshield. When she dragged herself upright seconds later, blood streaked down his face, eyes glassy. He wasn't breathing. Training took over, the kind of muscle memory that ignored pain, ignored hesitation, and moved faster than thought. She grabbed the radio, voice cutting sharp through static. Ambush, 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 coordinates incoming, all units, defensive positions. Gunfire erupted from the ridgeline, a blistering chorus of AKs hammering down into the kill zone. Trucks in the middle of the convoy swerved, some careening off the road into the dust. Soldiers scrambled for cover, bullets kicking up dirt around their boots. Chaos bloomed in seconds. And in the middle of it, Elena stood tall, scanning, calculating. She called for mortar fire, relaying precise grid points without hesitation, her voice level, steady. Shift 2 clicks north, danger closes end it. Her words carried the authority of someone who had been here before, someone who had survived this exact kind of hell. With a handful of soldiers still able to fight, she pulled together a flanking team. On me, she barked, and they followed, more out of instinct than trust. They cut across the ditch, slipping through the dust and smoke. Elena moved like she was born to it, rifle tight against her shoulder, eyes narrowing through the haze. She picked her shots carefully, squeezing off bursts that dropped figures along the ridge, each movement efficient, controlled. They breached a small compound the insurgents had been using as cover. Grenades first, then steel. Elena was the first through the doorway, her rifle bucking as she cleared the room. When the last insurgent fell, silence rang louder than the firefight ever had. By the time they regrouped at the convoy, air support had arrived, strafing the far ridges. The bodies of the dead were being gathered, both theirs and the enemy's. The road was a graveyard of burning steel and broken flesh. The men who had once mocked her now looked at her differently, wide-eyed, shaken, alive, because of her. But soldiers are creatures of pride, and pride bends truth into shapes that hurt less to swallow. By nightfall, the whispers had already begun. She just got lucky. Anyone could have called in fire support. The airstrike did the real work. Elena heard every word. She didn't flinch, didn't respond. She sat alone by the remains of a truck, smoke curling into the night sky, watching the embers glow. She had saved them all, but in their eyes, she was still the mascot. A woman who had stumbled into survival. A ghost no one wanted to believe in, even when she was the only reason they were still breathing. The air inside the debriefing tent was thick with the stale scent of sweat, canvas, and diesel fuel. Folding chairs scraped against the plywood floor as the battalion gathered, boots thumping in restless rhythm. The battle had been days ago, but its smoke still seemed to cling to the men, carried into the tent on their uniforms and under their skin. Maps spread across the table at the front showed red circles and black arrows, symbols meant to turn chaos into neat lines. But everyone knew what those symbols had cost. Captain Elena Ramirez sat near the middle, posture sharp, eyes forward, hands folded neatly on the table. She hadn't spoken since the convoy ambush. She hadn't needed to. The soldiers who had survived knew who had kept them alive, and yet, silence was never strong enough to hold back whispers. The junior sergeant stood abruptly, his tone half brazen, half uncertain, as if testing how far he could push. "With respect, sir," he said, looking toward the front but gesturing in Elena's direction, "some of us are still wondering how exactly that mess ended the way it did." I mean, one lucky call for fire support doesn't make someone a war hero. Anybody could have picked up a radio. Doesn't take a combat leader for that. The words fell like stones. A murmur rippled through the tent. Soldiers shifted in their seats, some nodding faintly, others staring at the table. The silence that followed was not absence of sound but attention, a taut wire strung across the room. Eyes darted toward Elena, waiting for her to snap, waiting for her to defend herself. She didn't move. Her face was carved from stone, unreadable, the same mask she had worn since the day Whispers had first branded her unfit for combat. The lieutenant who should have been leading the debrief was gone, his seat a reminder of the fragility of rank. All attention turned instead to the man at the head of the room, Colonel Marcus Dalton. He had been quiet until now, an immovable figure with salt and pepper hair and a face lined by 3 decades of war. His silence had carried more weight than any speech. But now, slowly, he set his glasses down on the table and opened the folder in front of him. When he spoke, his voice was gravel and iron. "You think Captain Ramirez survived on luck?" His eyes lifted, scanning the room, pinning the sergeant where he stood. "Then let's talk about luck." He tapped the folder, its corners worn from handling. "This is Captain Ramirez's combat record. I've been reviewing it, and I think it's time everyone here understands exactly who you've been sitting beside." The sergeant's smirk faltered. Dalton began to read. Kandahar, 2016. Night raid on an insurgent compound. Objective: eliminate high-value target. Gather intel. Ramirez entered first. Killed 5 combatants inside, secured intel, and dragged 2 wounded soldiers to safety under sustained fire. Mission successful, no casualties. That was her. The tent was silent except for Dalton's steady voice. Fallujah, 2017. Convoy ambushed by snipers. Ramirez neutralized the first shooter at 600 meters with a borrowed rifle, then orchestrated a retreat through a secondary route she alone had reconned beforehand. 26 men survived that night. 26. A chair creaked as someone leaned forward, listening harder now. Helmand Province, 2018. Ramirez took shrapnel to the shoulder and neck. Refused medevac. Stayed in the fight for 6 hours while leading a flanking maneuver that broke the insurgent line. 3 enemy positions destroyed, 0 friendly losses. Dalton's eyes flicked up, pinning the soldiers who had whispered. That was the 3rd time she refused evacuation despite wounds that would have sidelined most of you permanently. Every detail was delivered like a hammer blow. Names of operations, places that existed only in rumors, numbers that meant lives counted and saved. By the time he closed the folder, the room had shifted. Soldiers who had laughed at Elena now looked at her differently. Some with wide eyes, others with the kind of quiet shame that comes when truth burns away arrogance. Dalton leaned back, his gaze sweeping the room. Captain Ramirez doesn't need to defend herself. Her record does that for her. She's bled more for this battalion than most of you will ever be asked to. The next time you think about questioning her credibility, remember this. You're alive because she refuses to quit. The junior sergeant sat down hard, his face pale. No one spoke. The tent held only silence, not the barbed kind that cut Elena before, but the heavy kind born of awe and recognition. Elena's expression never changed. She didn't nod, didn't smirk, didn't break the mask. But deep inside, where no one could see, the sting of whispers had eased. For the first time in years, the silence wasn't an enemy, it was respect. The sound of Colonel Dalton's voice still lingered in the tent when the first hands came together. It was hesitant at first, one soldier clapping quietly, then another, until the whole battalion filled the room with applause. The sound rolled through the canvas walls like thunder. But Elena Ramirez didn't move. She stood rigid, her jaw set, her expression carved in stone. Applause had never been her currency. She had never fought for recognition, never bled for praise. She had done what needed to be done because no one else could, because hesitation meant death. To her, the clapping felt hollow, an echo that would fade long before the memories of the battlefield did. She left the tent without a word. The night outside wrapped around her like a familiar cloak, the Afghan air heavy with dust, and the faint smell of burning trash from the pits beyond the wire. Soldiers' voices carried from inside, still murmuring, the applause breaking into conversations. But out here, beyond the circle of light spilling from the entrance, there was only silence and shadow. Elena reached into her pocket and drew out a battered pack of cigarettes, lit one with steady hands, and inhaled until the glow marked her face in the darkness. She sat on an overturned crate just beyond the perimeter floodlights, the desert stretching black and endless around her. Each drag of smoke cut a brief ember into the night, her only company. The weight of the colonel's words pressed down on her chest harder than body armor ever had. Every mission he had listed came alive again in her head: the compound raid, the sniper fire, the long march through fire and blood. But what Dalton hadn't read aloud were the faces. Simmons, who bled out before the medevac arrived. Holloway, who never opened his eyes again. All the men she hadn't saved. They came back in silence, just as they always did, and sat with her in the dark. Footsteps crunched softly over gravel. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Colonel Dalton moved with a kind of deliberate weight, the gait of a man who had carried commands and coffins alike. He stopped a few paces from her, hands clasped behind his back, eyes narrowing against the glow of her cigarette. "They're reviewing your record," he said quietly, his voice low enough that the night almost swallowed it. "Pentagon's taking notice. Your name may finally reach the halls where it belongs. Medals, recognition, you deserve it." Elena exhaled slowly, smoke drifting upward into the Afghan sky. She turned her head, her gaze steady but tired. "Sir, I don't need a medal. I just need the respect of the men I bled beside." Dalton's mouth tightened, and for a long moment, he didn't answer. The floodlights cast shadows deep into the lines on his face, and his eyes carried a heaviness that words couldn't soften. Finally, he nodded once, a soldier's acknowledgement of truth spoken plainly. "That's fair," he said, almost to himself. Elena turned back toward the horizon, her cigarette burning lower between her fingers. Behind her, inside the tent, voices rose again. Whispers carried through the canvas, drifting into the night. She caught fragments, words repeated with a mix of awe and disbelief. "The ghost of Kandahar." Her face remained unreadable, the ember of her cigarette, the only light against the dark. She drew in one last breath, the glow flaring bright, then fading as she let the smoke curl away. The whispers carried on behind her, but she didn't rise to meet them. She had never needed names, never needed applause. The desert had taught her the truth long ago. All that mattered was survival and the silence that came after.